Greetings and welcome to QLF's webinar series, Voices of QLF. We are so pleased that you've joined us for this exchange among professionals who have dedicated their careers to the preservation of nationally significant cultural, natural, and historic sites. In this webinar, you will hear about the Chesapeake Gateways Network, an innovative collaborative of unique places and partner sites that provide opportunities to explore, experience, and conserve the Chesapeake Bay and its expansive watershed. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Brent Mitchell, QLF Senior Vice President, who will serve as the moderator for this episode. Brent, please unmute your video and audio. Many of you know that Brent has been with QLF for more than 35 years, and among his significant accomplishments, he has directed many of the organization's international conservation exchange programs, and he has held a long-term affiliation with the International Union for Conservation of Nature and the World Commission on Protected Areas, of which he serves as a vice chair. And importantly, Brent and QLF share a long-standing partnership with the National Park Service Stewardship Institute, a theme of today's webinar. Brent, I now turn this webinar over to you.
Thank you, Beth. It's a pleasure to be here with you all, and with three longtime colleagues from the National Park Service, Jonathan Doherty, Wendy O'Sullivan, and Rebecca Stanfield-McCown. I first want to address the question of why the Quebec-Labrador Foundation has been assisting a project so far from our primary geographic focus of the Atlantic region, which we define as ending at Long Island Sound. Part of the reason is our longstanding interest in large landscape conservation, of which the Chesapeake watershed is a great example. Another is that we often go where needs take us anywhere in the world. We've been working closely with the National Park Service for about 35 years. In those early years, NPS, QLF, and other partners ran an international planning program, the Countryside Stewardship Exchange, at sites in the UK, US, and Canada. We later extended that to other countries, and I met Jonathan when I asked him to join a team going to Central Europe. He'll say more about that in a few minutes. Two of our closest NPS partners in those exchanges, Rolf Diamant and Nora Mitchell, happened to live in Ipswich, where QLF is based. When Lawrence Rockefeller donated the childhood home of George Perkins Marsh to create Vermont's first and still only national park, his vision included an institute that would serve conservation nationally and even internationally beyond the hills of Vermont. Rolf would become the first superintendent and Nora the first institute director. Rebecca came to the group, then called the Conservation Study Institute, shortly after earning her PhD at the University of Vermont's Park Studies Lab. I met Wendy when QLF and the Institute were developing an urban agenda for the National Park Service. She was at the time the associate director for the Capital Region. Jonathan was assistant superintendent of the Chesapeake Office of NPS when Wendy became superintendent. We were all fortunate that he put off retirement to make a smooth transition and launch our strategic planning work. And thus, QLF is helping a program in the Chesapeake. I'll turn it over to Wendy to tell you a little bit about Chesapeake Gateways.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you for having us and for centering and highlighting the Chesapeake and our partnership with QLF and the Stewardship Institute. I just have a few sort of grounding slides to share, because to think about the Chesapeake, you really need to see the map. And so just starting here to give a little context, people think of the Chesapeake as the bay, but we work at the watershed scale. So the shaded area is the watershed for the Chesapeake, 41 million acres. So think of a football field is about an acre. So 41 million football fields large, from upstate New York, Cooperstown, New York, all the way down to the Virginia Tidewaters. This map helps you see the rivers and the creeks and the streams that all drain down to the Chesapeake. It's the largest estuary in North America. It is home to over 18 million people. It's the largest land to water ratio worldwide, 14:1. There are 36,000 species across the watershed. It's also home to the First Peoples. There are 7 federally recognized tribes in Virginia. There's 15 state recognized tribes in Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia. And this area is the heart of America, the founding of the country, the ongoing innovation of the country is here across the Chesapeake watershed, and the bay itself is a national treasure. There's been a 40-year effort to protect, restore, and conserve the Chesapeake Bay. It's a federal multi-state effort that includes all 6 states and DC, working with the federal agencies. And it began in 1983 with a watershed agreement between the states and the federal agencies. And then in the 90s, Congress brought the Park Service into the Chesapeake effort. And we conducted what's called a special resource study to determine if the Chesapeake was nationally significant. And of course, that study did find that the Chesapeake met the criteria to be acknowledged at the national level. And there was a process, there was a process that those that came before us went through to figure out how to truly bring the Park Service into this effort, how to center people, how to center conservation and history and heritage. If you go to the next slide, legislation was passed in 1998 called the Chesapeake Bay Initiative Act, and it was groundbreaking. It presented a new way of operating and thinking for the National Park Service. It established what's known as the Chesapeake Bay Gateways and Water Trails, and we shorten that now to Chesapeake Gateways. It set in place both a community assistance program where the Park Service could provide technical and financial assistance, as well as a partnership network to link together the special places, both federal, state, local, and the private sector that are bringing the stories and the heritage and the history forward for the Chesapeake. It was truly groundbreaking. It's still forward-leaning across the entire Park Service. It brought with it authorities that are special and unique. You'll see in the language here reference to not just nonprofits and governments, but also working with the private sector. Next slide. And really, the Chesapeake Gateways network is made up of 2 primary core pieces of the partnership. Chesapeake Gateways, which are the dots on the map, the places and spaces that bring forward what is authentic and special and unique about the Chesapeake watershed. So these are parks and refuges, historic sites, heritage areas. I happen to be today just at the launch of a new national heritage area called the Southern Maryland Heritage Area. They will join as a member of the Chesapeake Gateways network. Those special places are run by government agencies and nonprofits and sometimes private sector partners. They're all part of our network. We also work with strategic partners. These are network-wide and programmatic partners. They're helping to bring work forward and benefiting both the public and the network as a whole. But when we think about the Chesapeake Gateways network, kind of little n network, it is truly a bigger group. It includes those places, Chesapeake Gateways. It includes our strategic partners, but it also includes the many, many informal and aligned partners across the watershed. Next slide. And one of the things that I'm so thankful for with the Stewardship Institute, with Jonathan Doherty, and with Brent Mitchell and QLF is helping to establish and refresh the Chesapeake Gateways program by creating and working with partners to establish a new strategic plan. It was part of an effort to refresh, reinvest, and rebuild gateways. And these are the 4 core pillars of the strategic plan. And I think we're just going to dive into the conversation and do some introductions of dear colleagues that are here with us to talk about gateways together.
Thank you, Wendy. That was great. So I think we're first going to go to Rebecca to tell us a little bit about herself and the Institute.
Thank you, Brent. Yes, thanks for having us. And before I introduce myself and my role in this collaborative, I did want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Stewardship Institute, assuming that some folks have not heard of it. We're a small office of the Park Service. We're place-based at Marsh-Billings-Rockefeller National Historical Park. And Brent gave a pretty good overview of how the Institute got started. QLF was at the table when the Institute started. We consider them a founding partner of the Institute and really helped set the stage for what the role of the Institute would be, the type of work we would focus on, and what our mission is. At the Institute, we think of our work in 3 different categories. We focus on leadership development. What does it take to really support leadership skill development within the Park Service, with our partners, really thinking about how you create leaders that are ready to take on change and the challenges present in public land management. Our second bucket is collaboration and engagement. So how do we support parks and programs as they work to engage communities, develop strong partnerships, develop networks, some of the things that we'll be talking about here today. And then research and evaluation is our final area where we'd like to make sure that we're thinking about the impacts of our work. How do we integrate evaluation into everything that we do? And how do we look at research needs for public land managers and our partners, and establishing strong relationships with university partners to help us meet those research needs? So we have a very diverse portfolio across the Institute, but the Chesapeake has definitely been one of my favorite projects to work on over the past several years, getting to develop and really lean into the strategic plan, as we'll be talking about a little bit later. As Brent said, I came to the Institute from the University of Vermont, and I oversee all of our projects. My background really is focused in engagement and collaboration. So very happy to be here and to be able to talk and share more about the process that we all went through together.
Great, thanks, Rebecca. And if you remember Wendy's first slide, there was that jigsaw puzzle and all of the pieces. So next is the guy who put all those pieces together and made the connections, Jonathan Daugherty. You're on mute, Jonathan.
Thanks, Brent. It's good to be back and see all these faces with whom I've spent so much time over a number of years. It is when I think about the Chesapeake and when I first came to it in 1999, when after being out in the Pacific Northwest, we went around and talked to potential partners at that point, and asked them questions about what's really important here. Is it the natural side or the cultural side? And I remember so many people just looking at me as if I was dumb, because for them there was never a separation between the two. The Chesapeake has, since time immemorial, been that combination of nature and culture because of the resources, the geography, the human settlement. And I think that was profoundly influential on me and on how all of this has evolved. It's been a great pleasure, to work on it for so many years. And I think the other thing that the Chesapeake presents is as a challenge is its magnitude. It is truly working on a grand scale. And that presents a whole series of complications and challenges. It's been great to work with QLF and the Stewardship Institute on this. And it's, Brent, as you mentioned, I participated in some of the early countryside stewardship exchanges, one in Scotland, and then one when I met you in the Eastern Carpathians and Poland, Ukraine, and Slovakia, another big scale place. Seeing some harder times right now. So I'm thrilled to be back and part of the conversation, and because I think it really has a lot to say for how we address landscape in this country, if not beyond.
Great, thanks, Jonathan. So we're just, from this point, just going to have a conversation amongst us and see where it goes. But we had a couple of prepared questions to kick things off. Wonder if maybe start with Jonathan. What was learned through a participatory process to develop the strategic plan and to update the framework? What were some of the things that really came out for you as someone who knew the region well going into this plan that informed sort of the directions that the plan is taking?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, first of all, we have to recognize that we were developing this plan was it starting the fall of 2020? So it was right in the midst of the kind of that first year of the pandemic, right? And so everyone was working remotely. And the last time we did a strategic plan for the Gateways network in the early 2000s, we held regional workshops, we drew everybody together. But one of the things that I learned, we were forced to learn by doing things differently, was how well we could engage people if we did it creatively. We could engage people more effectively, more efficiently through a variety of techniques, including Zoom and interactive techniques. And I think the strategic plan was more informed than it would have been doing it the old way, frankly, with more people involved. And that was a tremendously creative process, I think. And SI and QLF were instrumental in helping design all of that. And I think that's really a fervent opportunity. I'd say one other thing, and then I'd let other people weigh in. One thing surprised me. I guess it surprised me. I was pleased by it, in that we found that a lot of the things that we started doing and started working on 15 or 20 years ago were the right things. And there was still work that needed to be done on them, but it wasn't as if 20 years later you had to take a complete right turn on everything. And that was intriguing. So I let others weigh in.
Okay.
I'll just build on that because coming in new, I started as the superintendent for NPS Chesapeake in 2019. I had been watching and following Chesapeake. My whole NPS career has been partnerships. And so Chesapeake is really the pinnacle of partnerships and collaboration. So I might have been stalking it a little when I applied and became superintendent. But I think the thing that was really remarkable during that process, and what Jonathan describes, QLF and SI set up a way to engage partners that included more people, heard from more people, got partners reconnected that hadn't engaged with each other in maybe a decade. And it grew in this way that helped both, I think, the Park Service remember how powerful Chesapeake Gateways is and can be again, and helped our partners see a future that was really exciting together. Because there is a little history here with the NPS Chesapeake office that, and it happens to program offices like ours, where other initiatives come forward and you get a little sidetracked, or you purposely focus on other things at times. And in the sort of early 2000s to the teens, several new national trails were created by Congress, and the Chesapeake Office for the Park Service helped stand those up. And so there was a period of time where attention sort of shifted from this concept of Chesapeake Gateways network and the community assistance program for that, really purposely focusing on these national trails. And so during the process to create the strategic plan, what my takeaway was how excited partners were to get back to the work of gateways. And that was really encouraging and really has helped launch us to keep, building and bringing it back in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I'll just add to that as thinking about the development of the process that we had for the strategic plan. Necessity is the mother of invention. Like, we were forced to try something different and try something new. And it really did allow us to be very innovative and creative and kind of be a bit risk-taking in the tools and technology that we were using to bring people in, but with a commitment to an authentic engagement experience with those people, that we really were focused on the relationship building. This wasn't about one-way communication. It was about bringing them into a dialogue with us, getting their engagement, their feedback, their inputs, a commitment to reporting back, responding back, telling them how we were using the information, keeping folks engaged throughout the development. So we were really thinking long-term across the development of the plan and then the launch and the implementation of how do we continue to develop these relationships and build on the relationships that we were so excited to see so many people engage in that virtual first workshop we did, but really intentionally building strong relationships with folks as we went so that we could continue to foster and reestablish the network through those relationships as we went.
Yeah, great. And as personally disappointing as it was for me to not be able to spend these last couple of years running around the Chesapeake, it is pretty amazing that, well, we're finally in November, we're going to have the in-person meeting that we were going to have at the beginning. So it'll be interesting to meet in 3 dimensions people that I've come to know on these little screens. But we wouldn't have, as the strategy was to really reach beyond the bay out to the full watershed. Had we had a traditional kickoff workshop, we wouldn't have gotten people down from Cooperstown and in from West Virginia. And so it was much more kind of democratic in terms of initial outreach, which was impressive.
Totally agree. And we by experiencing that, like testing those new ways, we've kept that going. We now run what we call Chesapeake Gateway chats that really are the core of those gatherings, and that are virtual gatherings, really stem back to those partner sessions we did to create the strategic plan together with partners, where, like Rebecca was just saying, so I'm going to take a little time out. I have been for years a huge fangirl of Rebecca, and all that she brings forward for partnerships, for collaboration, for inclusion and diversity. So just a little side shout out to Rebecca. And the Stewardship Institute, right? So the Stewardship Institute and QLF brought this concept to our office and the Chesapeake network of purposefully doing these touch points to very purposefully connect with partners. We are a network. We should know each other. It shouldn't just be sort of cursory and there's just, you know, names on a list of participants in a Zoom. And so maybe, Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind kind of describing what that was and what you all brought to us, and how we're still using it.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, Wendy. So we were really coming at this from, if we're a network, that means that we're trying not to be just a hub and spoke model. We're really trying to look at the network relationships of how all of the partners are connecting. And so everybody should be getting an opportunity to hear what other people are doing, to build connections with folks across the entire watershed, folks within their smaller geographic area. So during the course of developing the strategic plan, we had opportunities for folks to come together in small virtual groups to meet each other, share what they're doing. We started developing this thing that we call networking triads, where every time we kick off a chat, we break folks into groups of 3 and give them a kickoff question to chat with 3, hopefully new people, or maybe they're reconnecting with an old colleague that I haven't talked to in a while in a different area. But really being intentional about creating the opportunity for the network building. It's not just about us pushing information out. We have a lot to share, but we also know that our partners have a lot to share and have a lot of experience, and they're doing a lot of good work. And we want to make sure that they're getting an opportunity to hear from each other, to build those connections. So when we start each session, we make sure that there is that opportunity for them to learn about each other, reconnect, re-engage. And the feedback we get from that is amazing. It's a short amount of time. We take like maybe 7-10 minutes to do that, but it gives folks a chance to talk, to kind of set the stage for whatever conversation we're about to go into based on the question that we ask them, and to really center all of our partners in this conversation, that it really is about their engagement and their ability to connect and network. And so I find them incredibly valuable. The feedback we get is that they're incredibly valuable. And I think they keep us focused on what one of our main goals are of the strategic framework of rebuilding the network and really serving as a connector and a facilitator to the many, many partners and organizations across the watershed.
Well, and as I hear you both describe that, we've sometimes referred to this as a network of networks, right? Because if you think of how all those partners you just described organize over the landscape, right? There's a network of folks working on the James River and another on the Potomac. And then there are networks of similar organizations like the maritime museums, that communicate. And then there are state park networks, and there's a depth and richness in each of those that we at the center could never hope to fully understand or implement programs for on our own. And at the same time, we're each stuck in our own little network, so that cross-pollination is just creates so much fertile ground for innovation, and is truly the only way you can work in a multifaceted faceted landscape that is really the thing that draws everybody together. And I think, the point you had, Rebecca, there is that, these conversations keep the Park Service honest in terms of what its focus is, as a facilitator, as a convener, because everyone really, in a landscape so big with so many different needs and so many different roles, everybody needs to understand their own.
That's great. And one of the things we did when we were first starting the planning process was a colleague of ours, Jennifer Jewis, undertook a number of in-depth interviews with partners who'd been involved for a long time. And I was really particularly struck with how much they expressed interest in, taking advantage of the strengths of other network members and also being able to share their strengths and make connections, particularly with, there's a strong emphasis in terms of serving underserved communities and really connecting with people who haven't had access to many of the resources as much as others, and a realization that some of the more developed institutions needed really grassroots community level organizations, which I think are now coming into the network. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the important things that happened in the planning process for the strategic plan, like Jonathan said, the original framework for Chesapeake Gateways was so evergreen. There was so much of it that we literally picked up and jumped ahead 20 years and were able to, move forward with. The pieces that were new, beautiful threads that were weaved into the strategic plan were really about the moment the country was in, and leaning into inclusion and equity, telling full stories, making sure access was for all, turning the mirror on ourselves and looking to say, does the network reflect all of our stories? Are there new sites and new members that should be brought into the network? And all those conversations with the partners and purposefully seeking and bringing in new voices was part of the strategic planning process, and has made the strategic plan powerful and a guiding stretch, a guiding document that is aspirational, and so we're working on it, knowing that it's meant to be 5 years, and we're already seeing ourselves sort of looking beyond those 5 years because of the aspirational pieces in the strategic plan.
And I would add that due to the engagement of the partners and the position of the office, the strategic plan, the things that are in it aren't things that the Park Service can do on its own. This is something that really requires the whole watershed, the whole network to be engaged in, to be a part of. And so that really emphasizes the role of the program and of the Park Service of being that facilitator, of looking at how do we connect resources, how do we connect people, because in order for the plan to be accomplished, for us to be successful, it really is a full watershed movement. And so I think that speaks a lot to the grounding in this being from the ground up, what is needed across the watershed, and how we really look at resources and relationships across the whole watershed to advance all of us and not just one organization.
I want to interject something that, for some folks who may be listening, who, like many people in this country and around the world, think of the National Park Service and think of national parks. And I think that Gateways and Rebecca and Wendy represent a very significant aspect of the National Park Service that is focused beyond inclusive of, but beyond the national parks, in addressing resources that are spread throughout the landscape and partners that are spread throughout the landscape. And because the Park Service inherently, through its very mission, is intended to help conserve and provide for the public enjoyment of natural, cultural, and recreation, the full suite of resources, right? We're uniquely positioned among federal conservation agencies to be able to speak to a lot of people. And I think that and the partnership side of the Park Service has allowed the agency to play this I think, very special role in the Chesapeake. A special role that there's the ability to play elsewhere. But, we're talking about it in the context of the Chesapeake. But it just, time and again, many organizations and agencies have a harder time playing that convening and facilitating role across the broadest set of organizations than the Park Service can, just because we're uniquely interested in holding it all up, everybody up, I think.
That's a good point, Jonathan. And even within the Park Service, the Chesapeake has unique authorities and are better able to do that than most other places. And in fact, we won't go into depth now, but another project of the Institute that we're initiating is really looking at what authorities are needed for greater partnership models in other places across the system. So we've talked about developing the plan, and maybe this is a good place to transition to talk about how it's going to actually make that ambition a reality. And speaking of fan clubs, when Jonathan first approached the Institute to get involved in this process, we didn't know who the new superintendent was going to be. And then when it was announced that it was going to be Wendy, who we all knew, we were like, yeah. That's right.
Brett and I had some conversations and we're like,
That's fun.
So Wendy, maybe I'll toss that question to you.
Yeah, how it's going. So, the very first pillar of the strategic plan is to rebuild the Gateways network. And there are milestones, there are targets, and really what it means to rebuild the network is an investment by the Park Service back into the Chesapeake and the Chesapeake Gateways concept. So, I'm really proud that the leadership of the Park Service in our region and then the team, right in Annapolis has really taken these bold steps to rebuild the office itself, establishing new positions to bring support to the network. We are fundamentally a community assistance program. And so that means technical assistance and financial assistance. And technical assistance is done by people. And so it meant establishing a team to bring that support out to this humongous 41 million acre watershed. And, working with Jonathan and the regional office to design a team that could bring that forward. It meant looking at positions like communications positions to be able to engage with the public and the network. It meant thinking about pieces like that. In our legislation, it speaks to financial assistance and grants. So we have developed a new division that's partnerships and grants. And the next piece on sort of building the team is launching a new grant offering that happened this past fall. We're in the middle of reviewing applications. It's a competitive formal process for really the first time. This year marks the 25th anniversary of Chesapeake Gateways. And we're really excited to say our first official grant offering, we received over 90 applications. And it's just showing the excitement and need out there for the work that is and the themes that are framed out in the strategic plan. And so some of that work is very, very purposely focused on inclusive storytelling and resilient communities. And let me just define what it means by resilient communities for us, because it might be a little different than when you hear the word resilience or resiliency elsewhere. For us in the Chesapeake, resilient communities is not necessarily about living shorelines and, you know, getting ready for adapting to climate change. It is those things, but it is also very much more purposefully about vibrant, thriving communities. The whole piece of making places welcoming, about honoring and celebrating the history and heritage of places. It's about tourism, it's about large landscape conservation. And so when we talk about resilient communities, we're more. And that's the space that we've been really focusing on, is that nexus of conservation, access, inclusion, and have been establishing partnerships and starting to strategically move technical assistance and funding in this sort of very purposeful way about vibrant communities.
And I'll just touch on a bit of the process for that grant, because it really was a Herculean effort to ensure that with as much capacity as we have and with as much space as we have in the grant process, that we could make it as accessible to everyone as we could. So, you know, Wendy's team was really committed to, let's demystify the grant process. Let's ensure that we are giving people several different opportunities to understand what the focus of the grant is, what those priority areas are, how applications are going to be judged, what the criteria is, and even diving into the nitty-gritty of how do you apply for a grant, what are the actual mechanisms online, just really investing a considerable amount of time and trying to make the federal grant process not as cloaked in secrecy of all the different programs you have to go through and like all the different accounts you have to get set up, and really making themselves truly available through office hours open to everybody if they had challenges or questions, to really try to make it more user-friendly for folks that wanted to apply for the grant, so that we could have organizations, community organizations that were eligible, have the ability, know it was there, and have the ability to understand what the process is so that they could submit an application. And I think the fact that there were 90 speaks to really getting the word out there and providing people with some assistance to understand how the process really works.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And one of the big pieces that we did and worked really hard with our solicitors and our regional office on was to ensure that our legislation has two authorities to move financial assistance, and one does not require a match. That is the one that we used to launch this first grant offering, because we heard loud and clear in our listening sessions before we launched the grants that a match is a barrier to underserved communities, to smaller nonprofits. And so we worked hard to make sure that the network-wide Chesapeake Gateway grants do not have a match requirement. And that's been a very big deal. and is also why there were so many applications. We think there's a need out there that's bigger than what our appropriation is currently. We currently get $3 million a year for Chesapeake Gateways. We have $1 million carved out for the grants, and we received 9 million in asks. So there's a lot of exciting, neat work that needs support. And so that's a piece also of the strategic plan, is thinking through what are the other ways to knit dollars together. That network of networks that Rebecca and Jonathan was talking about, they all have other versions of dollars coming in from different directions. How do we leverage other funds to sort of up what we can bring to the network over time, whether it's state funds or other federal funds? That's a core piece of what's in the strategic plan, is finding ways to expand the pie, make the pie bigger, to bring to the network.
Great.
Brent, I'm just struck by, Wendy alluded earlier to the strategic plan as it's a 5-year thing, as most strategic plans are, and it's a good kind of planning horizon. But fundamentally, the kinds of, or a number of the kinds of challenges that Chesapeake Gateways is trying to address are in many cases the result of generational issues going back decades and decades, right? Or complex environmental issues that take a long time to address fully successfully. So you can see progress, right? But ultimately, this is it's a long-term agenda, which goes back to the nature of what Wendy and Rebecca were emphasizing, is that what's central to all of this is relationships, and relationships take constant care and feeding over time, so that we're moving along, because we're all in this for the long haul. And you see that progress as you move along, but there's still a ways to go.
Mm-hmm.
There's a famous great quote from a former Park Service director that the National Park Service is trying to conserve in perpetuity on annual appropriations.
Yeah.
As a long-term prospect. Wendy?
Mm-hmm. I was just going to add to the relationship building and do a little thank you to Jonathan. Coming into an office that has such a huge mandate, and beyond gateways, we also founded and co-convened what's known as the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, a large landscape collaborative across the watershed. We also have very serious responsibilities under that big federal multi-state restoration program. The Park Service helps track and monitor all the goals under that effort that are people focused. And if it wasn't for Jonathan being there, helping me understand the whole of the Chesapeake and both the responsibilities of the Park Service, but also the enormous opportunities for the Park Service in the Chesapeake, I just would not be able to function and see the way I can now. So he stayed longer than he maybe had planned before retirement, but he has missed every single day. And it's just so great to see you. And I just want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Wendy. As you were speaking, it drew 3 little examples to mind of that I think are testaments to the commitment of the Park Service in this effort. You mentioned the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, which a group of people that first convened in 2009, that's what, 14 years ago. A number of the people who came to that first meeting are still coming.
Yep.
Right? You know, they show up. And they've shown up every year. One of the organizations, I'm thinking of the Sultana Education Foundation in Chestertown, Maryland, was a tiny little nonprofit in 2001. It's led by the same folks, and it's today, and it has become a significant force in education. And they would say that the Park Service's early support and commitments were instrumental to helping them move forward. And frankly, I was at an event a week and a half ago at the Annapolis Maritime Museum, and I looked over to one of our colleagues and said, you know, I don't think we'd be here today at this spot if it hadn't been for the investments that were made 15, 18 years ago. And so it's this consistent commitment of the relationship. And I think really that as Wendy, you described it, pushing that forward and trying to address the moment, which is longer than a moment, that we're in now. One that is energizing a lot of folks because we have a lot of work to do.
Thanks. As we begin to wrap up, does anybody else have maybe a closing comment or a point that we didn't get to? We're about out of time. Great. Well, I just want to thank all three of you for joining us for this hour, and just to say that it's been a singular privilege to work on not only this project but also to work with the Institute for now 25 years or so. Really a privilege to be not just working with the Park Service, but oftentimes the kind of the cutting edge of what's going on in parks and protected areas in the States. And sometimes it's the bleeding edge, but it's always interesting. So with that, I think I'll turn it back to Beth to close us out.
Thank you, Brent, and thanks to all of you. This is so interesting. In closing, on behalf of all of us at QLF, I extend my heartfelt thanks and appreciation to our panelists, Wendy, Jonathan, and Rebecca, for participating in this webinar, and my gratitude to you, Brent, for organizing today's episode and serving as our moderator. Wendy, Jonathan, Rebecca, and Brent, your commitment to inspire preservation through partnerships and collaborative efforts are evidenced by your many accomplishments that we applaud. And a very special thanks to our webinar producer, Bill Steelman here in Ipswich, our webinar co-host, Krista Grant in Glasgow, Scotland. And to our viewers, thank you for joining with us today. This webinar concludes our third season. Throughout, we've sought to connect you with QLF alumni and partners whose experience, passion, and commitment have earned their prominence in conservation leadership in region and across the globe. Their stories best represent the remarkable continuum of experiential learning and sharing of conservation innovation that has defined QLF since its founding. And as we look to the future, we are committed to advance this proud legacy. Lastly, I invite you to join us in the fall for a new season of Voices of QLF. Until then, we send our best wishes to you. Be well.